Hello, everyone. This is Holly Wilson with EPA Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards. Thank you so much for joining us for this hour to talk about ethylene oxide Willowbrook data from January 2nd through the 17th. There are two ways for you to participate in this webinar, but we ask that you choose one. You may dial in through your phone. The number is there, 1-866-299-3188, and then the conference ID, 919-541-5265. If you choose to listen through your computer, we ask that you make sure that your computer is muted. If you're going to listen through your computer, you should be able to hear me coming through loud and strong, and if not, please type in your Q&A box and let me know that you're having problems. So when listening through your computer, just make sure that your volume is up. You'll see that it's circled, the second one with the volume. If you are going to seem like you're losing reception, just click out and then come back into the webinar, and that should take care of your problems if you're having any audio issues. For those of you who want to see the slides full screen, just click on the 4 arrows pointing out, and you'll get a full screen of the slides, and that might be helpful as we go through them in terms of seeing the details of the slides. Let's see, Q&A. We will take questions at the end. However, you may queue up your questions by typing them in. Jennifer has already started nicely, so thank you, Jennifer, for doing that. I think that is it for the day. These slides will be posted. You see the URL. I don't have a timetable just yet, but we'll get them up as soon as possible. And so now I'm going to turn over the presentation to Laura McKelvey, who will give you more details before we get into the presentation.
Thanks, Holly. So as we're loading this presentation, I wanted to let you know that Mike Kerber is going to be walking through the data that we've received between, as Holly said, January 22nd through January 17th.
January 2nd.
Is that not what I said? Oh, I said 22nd. Sorry. Lou corrected me, January 2nd through the 17th. We have a lot of technical folks in the room to help answer questions, so he'll be calling on folks along the way as needed. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike, but we did want to let you know that Bill Wareham is on to be able to chime in as needed. All right, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike.
Okay, thank you very much, Laura. And as you just heard, what we're here to talk about today are some additional air sampling that EPA has done for the first 3 weeks of January, specifically 7 days of air sampling. These data were just posted on the website a little more than an hour ago, so you may have already seen the table and the maps that we'll be showing you. So even though the slides aren't yet available, the data are available, so you should be able to see those. So 7 additional days, that brings the total of number of days that we have publicly available to 23. That represents about 10 weeks of data. So I'm going to focus on the 7 additional days that we collected in January. But before I do that, let me just make a couple points about the data that we have available. So it's 10 weeks. That's 3 more weeks than we had the last time. Nevertheless, we still believe it's premature to draw conclusions about long-term health risks from this limited set of data. And as we've been planning to do, we will continue to do air sampling at least through the end of February. We will continue to report the data and make it publicly available in batches as we have been doing. And just by my quick count, we have at least 16 more days of data. The rest of January and samples that will be and have been collected in February that still need to be provided back to us from our laboratory and quality assured. And all of that monitoring data and other information will be factored into a risk assessment that, again, we've been planning to do all along as part of our plan here, and to make that available, again, in the spring timeframe. Another point I wanted to make concerns our data for the month of February, specifically February 5th, in light of the results that the Village recently posted on its monitoring. I can assure you that we are working aggressively with our laboratory to get the next set of monitoring results as soon as possible, and to complete our quality assurance and make those data publicly available as quickly as we can. But we don't have that yet, and we're not here to talk about February data today. Again, we're going to focus on the 7 additional days for the month of January. So we have, next slide up, this is the monitoring network. I think you're all familiar with the 8 sites that we've established near the facilities and in the surrounding community. The 2 facilities I should point out are the purple boxes with the X's in them near the Willowbrook Village Hall and the EPA Willowbrook warehouse sites. So those are the 2 sterilization buildings. And as you know, we have those 2 Village Hall and warehouse sites in very close proximity to those particular locations. I guess just one other thing to note is that the locations of the monitoring sites as well as the facilities are somewhat approximate. This is a PowerPoint slide, so we don't have the exact precise locations of the emissions facilities or the actual monitoring locations, but they're pretty close to where you will find them in the real world. But keep in mind, these are fairly approximate locations on this particular slide. This is the calendar of sampling. We showed this to you the last time. It reflects our 1- and 3-day sampling schedule that we have planned for this program. You do see a few adjustments to accommodate holidays, other special days. Some of you in the Chicago area know what the last week in January was like, and as you can see, we did not do sampling on January 30th because it was very, very cold that day. So we skipped that particular day, and we'll be picking that up with some additional sampling in February. And as I said earlier, we will continue sampling through at least the end of February, and as we get the next batch of data, you'll see the February calendar pop up in our next webinar. So let's talk about the data. And our first slide represents the 10-week average concentrations. We showed you a similar version of this the last time, which represented a 7-week average. Now we have 10 weeks of data, so you see a 10-week average. Nothing significant about 10 weeks other than it represents the data set to date. What this slide exemplifies are really 3 features that we see in looking at the data for most of the days. Number 1, we see that the highest concentrations occur at the 2 close-in sites, at the Village Hall and the warehouse site. So we continue to believe that the facility is responsible for a significant amount of ethylene oxide in this area. Number 2, we see that the concentrations drop off fairly quickly as you move away from the facility. So as you move away from the 2 purple boxes with the X's in them, away from the sterilization facilities, you do see lower concentrations as you move towards the 6 outlying community-oriented sites. And then number 3, we do see lower concentrations at the 6 community-oriented sites. These concentrations, I should note, do represent some days when a particular monitor is downwind of the sterilization facilities, but they also represent many days when they are not downwind. And that suggests to us that there are other sources of ethylene oxide in the area that we need to better understand. And as we reported the last time, that is an area of active investigation on our part. We still do not have answers, but we do have a process for trying to come up with those answers. And in particular, we're looking at emissions inventories. We're looking closer at these monitoring data and other monitoring data we're collecting around the country related to ethylene oxide to get a better handle on what are these other sources of ethylene oxide, but we do not have those answers today, but we are continuing to work on that. So let's look at the individual 7 days, and we'll take them one at a time, starting with January 2nd. And as we've talked in the past, we have provided a windrows in the upper right-hand corner on each of these days. So just a quick refresher on how to read a windrows. You see spokes and you see colors. The spokes represent the direction from which the wind is blowing. So on this particular day, the wind is blowing from the southwest. So the wind is going from the southwest to the northeast. So from the lower left to the upper right on the page, if you will. The colors represent wind speed. So hotter colors represent stronger winds, higher wind speeds. So January 2nd. January 2nd is a Wednesday. It happens to be what I'll call an off-cycle sampling day. Again, we typically monitor on a 1- and 3-day schedule. This day was adjusted because of January 1st. So the sampling started on January 2nd, not on December 31st, which I believe was the originally scheduled day. The winds on this particular day, again, are from the southwest. And overall, I guess I'd characterize this as a lower concentration day. You see a mixture of non-detects at 4 locations and readings on the order of around 0.2 micrograms per cubic meter at 4 other sites. The next day, January 3rd, you'll notice the windrows didn't change too much from the prior day. Winds are also out of the southwest on this particular day. It too can be characterized as a lower concentration day. We once again have a mixture of non-detects, in this case at 5 locations, and readings on the order of 0.3 to 0.6 micrograms at 3 other locations. The next day, January 6th, is a Sunday. We have winds out of a range of different directions, going from east-northeast through south-southeast, which suggests transport towards the west of the facility. And we see concentrations at the Village Hall on the order of about 7 micrograms as you move downwind towards the west. The west neighborhood site is a little more than 1.5 micrograms. And then by the time you get to Gower Elementary, the concentrations are down around 0.2 micrograms. Again, there is some indication of transport from west to east, from the right to the left on this particular map. January 9th, a Wednesday, you see transport out of the northwest, or winds out of the northwest, suggesting transport to the southeast. So movement from the upper left to the lower right on this particular page. The upwind sites, West Neighborhood, Hinsdale South, Willow Pond, are on the order of 0.1 to 0.2 micrograms. Moving downwind from the facility, we see a reading of about 3.8 at the Village Hall. That falls off to about 0.7. Looking at the co-located value for the warehouse site, the primary sample being determined to be invalid, and then concentrations falling off to about 0.3 micrograms at Gower Middle School. January 12th, a Saturday, winds out of the east-northeast, suggesting transport to the west. And we see the highest value on this day at the Village Hall of about 1.5 micrograms. Moving to the west, we see the west neighborhood at 0.7 and Gower Elementary at about 0.2. Two more days, and these in fact are the 2 highest days among the 7 that we're reporting out on today. January 15th, a Tuesday. Winds are mostly out of the southwest, as you can see from the windrows. But interestingly, we did have several hours out of the north and northwest, which may explain the concentration pattern on this particular day. We see the highest concentration at the warehouse site of 14 micrograms, and then Gower Middle next in line at about 0.9 micrograms. This is the day where the winds were quite variable. You did have many hours with winds out of the southwest, as indicated by the windrows, but you did have a significant number of hours suggesting somewhat of a transport from the northwest to the southeast. And our final day, January 17th, this too was a high sampling day. Winds were predominantly out of the west, although we had some hours out of the northwest. The upwind sites, West Neighborhood, Hinsdale South, Willow Pond, on the order of around 0.1, 0.15 micrograms per cubic meter. The warehouse site, 13 micrograms, and then downwind towards Gower Middle, about 1.6 micrograms. So that concludes a quick run through the 7 additional days. Again, that brings us up to 23 days available, about 10 weeks of data. We are continuing to sample. We will continue to report out the next batch of data as soon as we have received all of that and completed our quality assurance. So that's probably going to be another week or two before we're ready to come back and report on that. And we expect that next batch will include data from early February, so we can match that up against the village's recently reported data.
All right, thanks, Mike. We're going to take just a minute to get our questions in order, and then we will start answering questions. All right, thanks, folks. So the first question is one that typed in before the webinar even started, but so we'll start with it. Concerning the question about upwind samples of EPO, what the wind roses would suggest should not be seen as discounting for a moment Mr. Wareham's comments about furnaces or as sources of ETO. I wonder if general wind rose data may not reflect apparent wind conditions seen on the ground due to interference of buildings, and that ETO is heavier than air and would tend to be lower to the ground.
Yeah, this is Mike Herber. I have Lou Weinstock, our monitoring expert, with me, who will help answer this question. Let me just say that the wind roses that we prepared are intended to provide a general indication of wind flow and wind patterns for these 24-hour sampling periods. Certainly there's further analysis of the information, like looking at hourly data, that would be helpful. The wind data were collected at the warehouse site for most days. We've compared those on many of the days to Argonne data and data from surrounding airports, and they're all pretty consistent, but the question is a very good one. You can have local influences that can alter the direction. Whether that's specifically happening in this area, a little difficult to say, but we do know we're using data collected at the warehouse site, so as close to where we're collecting the samples as possible. Lou, you want to take a deeper dive into that?
Yeah, and I think Mike really hit on the salient points, and this is a perceptive question. And again, as he noted, we do cross-check both the data from the tripod on the roof of the warehouse, the very detailed and well QA data from Argonne, which I believe is a 60-meter tower a mile or two away. And we also eyeball it with Midway Airport And on the occasions we've compared, remarkably, they all compare really well. So I think we have confidence that the data that we're using for these wind roses very well represents the flow in the region. However, it is true, and Mike mentioned this, that our maximum receptor sites are very, very close to the facilities, to the buildings, and it certainly is possible that there's what we might call microscale or really small scale effects that we can't quite measure. Just as you may walk through, downtown Chicago sometimes and hit a bit of a wind tunnel that surprises you because of wind going through buildings, it's plausible that wind flow around these facilities, particularly when the winds are actually quite light as well as strong, could influence some of the things that we're seeing. So we do look very much in detail, particularly the maximum concentration sample days that Mike mentioned, try to explain why that is. To date, they line up very well with the wind direction. It seems to make a lot of sense, but we're always looking for more information and more details to try to explain what we're seeing.
All right, the next question. In one of yesterday's posts, I saw that EPA seems to claim fugitives as the cause of the recent high ambient results near the facility. While this is possible, I would expect higher values in November and December measurements too. I still think that it might be possible that certain ambient conditions cause stuff from the stack to be pushed down more quickly and cause the high values. Any thoughts on this, or is it worth asking EPA if they have any further information on this? Or I guess any thoughts on this?
This is Mike again. In response, I'll just note that we're continuing to gather information on emissions as well as operations of the facility, and that includes information about exhaust gas release information, stack heights, flow rates, things like that, all very important information, as well as local weather data, which we just talked about. And again, our intent is to use all of that information in our refined risk assessment.
Okay.
Hi folks, it's Allison Davis. We also had a question about the status of the cancer study, and that is something that the state of Illinois Health Department is doing. I checked in with their public information officer a few hours ago, and they are still anticipating issuing their report toward the end of March.
Okay, so the next question is how will the GHG data, so the data from the municipality that Willowbrook has been doing, be used?
This is Mike again, and first let me thank the Village of Willowbrook for their investment in collecting additional sampling. As many folks are aware, there is co-located sampling going on at Village Hall and a number of other locations, and I think that co-located sampling will really help verify and validate the data, the monitoring data that are being collected, which again are critical to the refined risk assessment that we are doing. In addition, they have sampling at other locations where we do not have monitors. So I think we'll want to look at all of that information together, make sure it is all quality assured, so we can use it again in our risk assessment.
And the next question is probably one that I need to answer is when will the EPA be coming back to Willowbrook to discuss our risk assessment? And we are actually starting the planning process for that. I think we are looking towards the beginning of May. That would make sure we're not interfering with anybody's spring break. But that is not tied down yet. But that's the idea, is to give us a chance to complete the risk assessment. And then, finish collecting the data, do the risk assessment, and then come back to you guys with the results. So that is in the planning process, and we are shooting for the early in May. Okay, the next question. Why is Sterigenics meeting with EPA and not residents? Can EPA force them to face the residents' questions?
This is Mike Herber. I think many folks are aware that EPA convened a meeting back on February 7th in Chicago to talk with the company, to talk with the state of Illinois, as well as EPA, about its emissions and its operations. That meeting I think will be helpful in trying to find a long-term sustainable solution here. So we're trying to gather that information, and we're getting that information directly from the company, but we're also getting it directly from our air monitoring, and we'll get more information from our upcoming risk assessment.
Okay, so a real quick question is, where do you find the data released an hour ago? We posted the link to the website, or the posting site, in the notes at the top of your screen, so that should be there. The next question, are you going to be adding a test site to the northeast quadrant around Sterigenics? How can you accurately gauge downwind ambient air if you are not getting results from the area to the immediate northeast when the weather rows show winds from the west and southwest and bring emissions to the east and northeast?
This is Mike again. Let me start, and then Lou, you can get into a little more detail here. Once again, this was monitoring that we established to help inform our risk assessment. It will be a modeling-based risk assessment. Modeling is a more powerful tool spatially to characterize concentrations in the area. We knew all along that wherever we put monitors, we were going to miss some locations. It was never our intent to put a monitor at each and every street corner in the area to provide a complete spatial picture. It was rather to collect air measurements, ambient measurements that we could use to help support our modeling-based risk assessment. That modeling-based risk assessment will characterize concentrations to the northeast and everywhere throughout the area. So that's when we will be providing that particular information. Lou, do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. And again, if the data that Mike went over today, as well as the data we presented a while back with the winds and the concentration pattern, while we don't have a monitoring site to the northeast, which is acknowledged, we do have excellent coverage to the north, the northwest, to the west, to the southeast, and we've described a number of scenarios where those sites have been downwind of Sterigenics. In some of those situations, we have picked up a signal we've discussed, not nearly what we're measuring at the maximum concentration sites. The highest that we've seen at any of the residential locations is something on the order of 1.6 micrograms per cubic meter, and that certainly is acknowledged to be higher than background. But I think we're confident that if a site was located to the northeast, there is absolutely no reason to expect that the concentration we would see there would be any different than what we're seeing in the West neighborhood or Gower Middle School or Hinsdale South or the water tower. There's no reason to think the dilution and dispersion to the northeast is any different than any of those other directions. So the fact that we have got a really nice distribution of wind directions across these days so far gives us confidence that we actually do have a good idea of what the footprint of the facility is. But we do understand that if you live to the northeast, there isn't a sample value in your neighborhood, and we understand the frustration there.
Okay. The next question is, have you been in communication with Willowbrook's independent testing agency?
Yeah, again, this is Lou Weinstock. And again, I want to commend the Village of Willowbrook and the cooperation we've had with both their consultants and through them to the laboratory who's providing their analysis. We have an ongoing dialogue between ourselves, our lab, as well as the Village of Willowbrook's experts. We're sharing information. We are sharing quality assurance data and looking at each other's numbers so we can jointly have as much confidence as we have in these numbers. So the cooperation has been good, and we certainly are pledged to continue it in the future.
Okay, the next question is, we've had a lot of questions around having the information around the background concentrations of ETO and the information coming from homes' furnaces. So we'd like to get some more data and background on where that information can be found.
This is Mike, and before I address that directly, let me just restate what I said earlier about us seeing the highest concentrations at the two close-in sites, which we think clearly does continue to show that the facility is responsible for a significant amount of ethylene oxide in this area. So I think that is a very important point that needs to be understood. With respect to other sources of ethylene oxide. I mentioned again the process that we are going through, looking closer at emissions inventories to look for gaps, to look for discrepancies, as well as looking at ambient monitoring data. These data, as well as other data that we are starting to examine across the country, again, by comparing and contrasting that information, it may allow us to better understand what these other sources of ethylene oxide are. We just don't know at this point what specific other sources are out there, but it's something we are actively working on, and we have a process underway to try to get that information.
And how is EPA working with OSHA to protect workers where the ethylene oxide levels are dangerously high?
Yeah, our focus here has been, and EPA's authority is under the Clean Air Act, to address outdoor air pollution, and that is what we are focused on with our study and our risk assessment.
Okay. If you've not had, sorry, my tongue and my mouth is not working together. If you do not have enough data, how can you stop testing in February?
So our plan from day one was to sample for 3 months, and we are coming up on the end of that 3-month period. We'll be there at the end of February. So we will continue at least through the end of February to meet our original goal, again, to have ambient data that we can use to support our full refined risk assessment. So we're close to having that full data set. We have 10 weeks. We've reported out to you so far, and we expect to have another 16 or 15 more days of information to look at. So 23 days so far. We have another 15 or 16 still to collect. That will give us the data we think that we need to move forward with our modeling-based risk assessment.
Okay. What's the process to understand background sources of ETO, and where are you testing for ETO to determine background, and what's the timing to release that information?
Yeah, this is Mike. I talked about that at a pretty high level. It's really two-pronged. One-pronged is looking at emissions inventories. EPA has a national emissions inventory. We also have a toxics release inventory, and it's a matter of going back and mining that information further. We have that information for 2017 calendar year, and as many of you know, the National Air Toxics Assessment that we released last August was based on 2014 emissions data. So we have more current information and perhaps more complete information for calendar year 2017. We want to go back and mine that information to better understand other sources, potential other sources of ethylene oxide. In addition, the monitoring data is certainly giving us some insights. The data here has given us some insights. So we need to go back and mine this data, looking at days when these particular monitors are in fact upwind of the 2 sterilization buildings. And as I noted earlier, we need to look at ethylene oxide measured concentrations in other parts of the country. And I think we've mentioned in the past, in Colorado, for example, they have collected data. We need to factor that in. And we have a national network of air toxics monitors. I think we've mentioned in the past that we are starting to look at ethylene oxide measurements as part of that network. So as that information becomes available, that will also help inform what are these potential other sources. So it's a matter of looking closer at emissions data as well as ambient monitoring data. But that's a process. It's just starting. We don't have answers. When we do, we will come back and talk with you about that.
Similarly, could background ETO levels be caused by emissions from the previous day? ETO has a very long half-life, so even if the winds change directions, the environment would still have a residual impact.
This is Mike again. That certainly is a possibility, and it'll be something that we look at as we further analyze these monitoring data that we've collected.
Okay, couldn't it be that Sterigenics is not really accurately reporting their usage and emissions?
So the company was reporting to the toxics release inventory, and that has given us some historical information. More recently, there was the stack test that was conducted that gives us actual measured information. from at least that particular release point. And I think we've talked with all of you about how we're going to use the monitoring data to maybe better inform our knowledge about things like fugitive emissions and possible other emissions coming from the facility.
It should be possible to correlate the results from the monitors with activity and emissions from the company. Have you tried to work with the company to do this? Are you assuming that they are working 24/7 and that the emissions are consistent?
Yeah, I think it would be possible to correlate the monitoring results as well as the operations of the facility. And we have had discussions with them about getting information about their operations on these sampling days to really better inform the risk assessment, but also to maybe better understand some of the monitoring results that we're seeing here. But that's an ongoing process.
Okay, then is there a difference between the GDH testing equipment, which is the equipment that, or the company that Willowbrook is using, and EPA's testing equipment? Is one more sensitive than the other?
Yeah, Laura, this is Lou Weinstock. Again, I don't necessarily want to speak for GHD, but we've had good conversations through the village of Willowbrook with the GHD folks, and we consider both the equipment we're using and the methods to detect ethylene oxide at this point to be identical. The sensitivity levels of both methods are pretty much the same. We're sharing quality assurance information. We just got a detailed package through the village for GHD sampling. We're going to be taking a look at that. We'll be sharing the same when we get it from our lab. So for everything we know through our conversations, I think you can place the monitoring results from GHD as well as EPA together and compare them.
Okay, and so what's the relevance of background levels once you've identified a large industrial source?
When we do our risk assessment, we want to characterize the complete ethylene oxide concentrations in the area. So to the extent that there is an impact from this facility on top of a background level, we want to understand the total impact, the total concentration.
Yeah, and sorry, Mike. This is Lou Weinstock. I wanted to just add a little more information about the question about GHD testing equipment. We talked about the methods and the equipment itself, which really is identical. But the one thing to point out, of course, is that GHD is doing indoor testing, and they're testing at different locations than we are. So to where we have co-located samples, and that's been going on for some time now, of course the results are comparable, but the village has different objectives with their testing, so their equipment, again, is indoors, different floors of the buildings and at different locations. And as much as we'd like at that point, we can't compare that.
So are there any days that sampling that coincide with Willowbrook's testing, and do the two results compare?
This is Mike. As we said earlier, we're just reporting out on 7 days for the first 3 weeks of January. Co-located sampling started on, I believe, Tuesday, February 5th by the village of Willowbrook at the village hall site and a couple other sites in the area. And on Friday, February 8th, my understanding is that Sterigenics also started doing co-located sampling at some of those sites. So we are sharing schedules with the village to try to coordinate our sampling. We don't have any of the February co-located data to speak to today. As I reported earlier, we are working aggressively with our laboratory to get those results, complete our quality assurance, and promise that we will come back and talk with you about it as soon as we have that available.
Okay, when will EPA be conducting stack testing, and should they reopen at some point?
This is Mike. The state of Illinois is the one that required the stack testing last summer, not federal EPA. So because Illinois EPA is the permitting authority, My understanding is that the state would be the one that would be talking with the company about any further emissions testing.
Okay, so we had a question about whether we're going to be posting these questions. We are going to try to answer them. We've got a lot of questions backlogged. We will be capturing these and we will get them as we can. So that's fun. And then the next question is, what agency would be responsible for indoor air pollution?
This is Mike. That would be OSHA, Occupational and Safety Health Administration. EPA does have an indoor air office, so we do have some experts there, but they don't do indoor testing. They don't set indoor standards. It would be OSHA would be the relevant agency here.
So we have another question, is will the days that Styrogenics is shut down be included in the risk assessment?
We are continuing to sample. We are sampling this week. We sampled on, I believe, at least 2 days this week, and we'll continue to sample through at least the end of the month. So that is information that will be in our data set, and will certainly be information we will want to look at closely as we put together emissions and other information that will go into the risk assessment.
Yeah, so again, just to clarify, if Styrogenics stays closed, will EPA continue to sample?
So again, our plan was to sample for 3 months through the end of February. We are rapidly approaching that, and we will then take that information to move forward with our risk assessment. We don't want to delay the risk assessment by doing more monitoring. We want to move quickly to the risk assessment, look at those results, and report those out to all of you as quickly as we have those.
Okay. Do these reflect the usage of Styrogenics claim if the scrubbers takes away 99% of the 0.9% of the pollution?
What the ambient measurements that we're talking about today represent are the readings from these air monitors, which certainly reflect impacts from the sterilization facilities, and perhaps to a lesser extent other sources that may exist in the area. The information does not allow us to verify control efficiency at any of the operations at the facility.
So, you know, how do the sampling data translate to cancer risk? And I just wanted to just say that we've got plans for doing 3 webinars. The first one is Air Toxics 101. The second would be participating in our regulatory process. And another one will be how we do risk assessments. And so, you know, what we did with NADA was a screen, you know, kind of the steps that we take to do the more refined risk assessment. So I ask you to participate in that so that you understand how the risk assessment process works.
And this is Mike. Let me just add that when we do risk assessments, our benchmarks are based on a 70-year lifetime exposure. Here I'm talking about an individual day, 24-hour measurements. I also showed you a 10-week average. Neither are directly comparable to the 70-year lifetime benchmarks that we use in our risk assessments.
Okay. So, how does EPA think that what's going on in Styrogenics is going on in other sources? Is there? Let me start over. I'm trying to get clarification, get some clarification in my mind around this question. Oh, so this is a background question. What do we think? Why do we think that there are other sources? Is this just kind of covering the range of specific science possibility, or is there real concern that there's exposure from these other sources?
So as we said before, we don't know what other sources of ethylene oxide might be in this area or any other area. That's an area of active investigation. What we are seeing at some of the 6 community-oriented sites is a fairly consistent pattern of levels on the order of 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, even 0.4 micrograms per cubic meter. On days when those locations are upwind, clearly upwind of the sterilization facilities, which is suggestive of other sources in the area. But obviously, to fully answer this question, we would want to identify what those sources are, and we just don't know that at this time, but it is something we are looking at.
Okay, and has Sterigenics commissioned any testing of ambient emissions other than background levels across Chicagoland?
I think folks are aware of a report that they released reflecting measurements around the Chicago area in the months of October and November 2018. And as I said earlier, they are also starting to do co-located sampling, I believe starting on Friday, February 8th. I don't, off the top of my head, remember which locations those are, but they did start at least doing co-located sampling at the Village Hall site, I believe, on that particular day, and may be continuing to do co-located sampling.
Okay, so the air sampling that was contemplated to have 3 months of data with the facility open, since it's closed now, does that impact your analysis?
We have almost 3 full months of data reflecting when they were operating. We'll have another week this week of information when they were shut down. So almost the full data set will reflect operation of the facility. The information from this week when they weren't operating will certainly be informative to understanding what their impact is on the surrounding community.
Okay, so you had a question about stack testing earlier. What data are you referring to? Is it the stack testing to confirm upgrades done during the summer?
This is Mike. Again, we can't, at federal EPA, really speak to stack testing. The state of Illinois is the permitting authority. They're the ones that required the previous stack testing. And my understanding is they would be the entity that would be discussing any further stack testing with the facility.
Okay. Does EPA assume that concentrations of ETO in our area resets when the clock strikes 12? Does that mean EPA is not assuming high levels inside buildings means that simply opening the doors the next day at the Village Hall could emit stored ETO into the neighborhood?
Yeah, again, the source of other sources of ethylene oxide is one that we are continuing to look at. We don't have answers on that today. Whether there's carryover from one day to the next, I think that'll be something that we examine closer as we do our risk assessment and look further into the ambient monitoring data.
Okay. Will EPA demand Sterigenics share ambient testing results and the associated data packages?
Let me start and then I'll turn over to Lou. And I'll just note that the company has been cooperative in terms of discussing their intentions to do ambient monitoring and to share any information that they may collect. So I think we will want to keep those lines of communication open and receive that information on as timely a basis as possible, recognizing that they too have a quality assurance process that they will want to go through to make sure that they have and are releasing validated data. Any more?
Okay. We're trying to kind of get the questions copied here. Just a second.
So folks, I'm just going to do a time check here. We are about 10 minutes away from the end of this webinar. So you've been thinking of questions, try and get them in, and we'll do the best we can with the remaining 10 minutes.
Thank you, Holly. Does EPA have a statement in regards to Sterigenics being shut down?
This is Mike, and of course we're here today to talk about the data that we've collected. We are certainly mindful of other things that are happening, And we do understand that the judge denied the temporary restraining order yesterday. In Willowbrook, our network of monitors will remain in place. I mentioned before our plan to continue sampling through at least the end of February, and we think that this will continue to provide valuable information, in particular to inform our risk assessment. We will keep working with the state and the village, and again, we promise that we will continue to make this critical quality assured information about ethylene oxide, in particular the monitoring results and the information from the risk assessment, available to the community as soon as we have it ready.
And when will you be ready to decide next steps? When after the risk assessment is updated?
We are coming to the community in May to have that conversation, and to the extent that there needs to be discussions before then, we will continue to have those conversations. And that may be in the form of a webinar. It could be in the form, Laura, I know you're having these planning calls. There are a number of vehicles that we could use to try to convey that information prior to the public meeting.
What oversight and chain of custody is being done to ensure someone is not manipulating the results?
This is Lou Weinstock. Again, we've had a lot of support from our partners at Region 5. The monitors have a lot of documentation with them. When they're put out, they're checked very closely. When they're deployed, certain operational characteristics of the canisters are checked when they're picked up to make sure they're not tampered with. When analysis is done in the laboratory, we're looking for certain markers that might indicate tampering. Remembering from early on in the study that in fact some of these monitoring sites are in fact under surveillance, for instance at the school sites. So I think we're feeling confident that the results we've reported to date fairly represent the ambient air at these monitoring sites.
Can you remind us again, hold on. Yeah. Can you remind us again why there aren't sampling locations in the Northeast? The vast majority of the days we've seen samples since the study began that are coming from the Southwest.
Yeah, go ahead, Lou.
Again, this is Lou Weinstock. I know we touched upon this earlier. You know, again, going back to the objectives of the study, to characterize fugitives, to support the risk assessment, you know, to characterize concentrations in some of the neighborhoods, and acknowledging that it wasn't a commitment or an objective of the study to measure each and every location that could be downwind. As Mike mentioned earlier, the modeling study that we will do as part of the risk assessment will be all-encompassing in terms of every possible location. But given the variety of winds we've seen on these 23 sample days, you know, I'm very comfortable that dispersion to the north, the west, and the south represents the same types of mixing we would have to the east. And given the concentrations we've seen at the residential locations, I think we in fact do have a good idea of what we would measure to the northeast if a site was there. But again, we acknowledge that there's a frustration that we don't have a point in the map there, but we feel like the other ones fairly represent what would happen there if the wind was from the southwest.
Okay, and does Sterigenics still know EPA's testing cycle?
This is Mike. Yes, they do. Everyone knows our testing cycle. We had that in our monitoring plan, 1 in 3 days, and we were very transparent on that when we issued our monitoring plan and discussed that with the community leaders back in October as we were designing our study. Having said that, we have made adjustments along the way. So there are a number of what I call off-cycle sampling days, not strictly on the 1 in 3 day schedule. So there are adjustments, and during the month of February, we've made a number of adjustments because of President's Day, and there may have been, the January 30th day I mentioned. We had to pick up that day. So that resulted in an extra day that we had to pick up, again, off-cycle. So it's not strictly a 1 in 3 day schedule. There have been adjustments along the way. Laura, looks like we got 5 minutes or another couple of questions here.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I'm just trying to, I'm sorry, I'm a slow reader, folks. It's got to get me a chance to read the question. Okay, when will all the unanswered questions be posted? And Allison, you want to answer
Hi,
that one?
folks. It's Allison, and we recognize that there's some questions we have not gotten back to you all yet. We are still catching up from the government shutdown, and we are working as hard as we can to get as many of those answered that we have answers for.
I'm sorry, guys. We're trying to get through as many questions as we can. We're looking for some themes to make sure we can combine as many similar questions in one. So give me just a second. Okay. So we have, I think we've gone through many of the questions, so I wanted to start identifying some of we've got some statements here, not questions, and that's why we're kind of struggling here. But so I'll read some of the statements that seem to be thematic. One is, what is Kathy Kaufman's response to the ongoing sterigenics issues? And I don't know that we've heard anything. You know, that we've had some discussions with them about the technical details of the analysis that we're doing, but we don't have any statement from the company on what's going on in the area.
Yeah, I'll just note that we've been trying to work with them cooperatively on gathering information that we will need to inform our risk assessment, and they have been working with us cooperatively.
That one. So why would we claim that there are other sources when we have no idea what they could be?
Yeah, as I said earlier, we're seeing pretty consistent levels on the order of 0.1 to as much as 0.4 micrograms at some of the 6 community-oriented sites, in particular on days when they're clearly upwind of the sterilization facility, which is enough of a basis for us to look and see what other sources of ethylene oxide may exist in the area. Right now, we have no idea what those sources are, but it's something we're continuing to look at by digging into emissions inventories and better analyzing the air monitoring data.
So I think we're at 2 minutes, so let's take a minute to just wrap up and just put out there, we are trying to set up the Air Toxics 101 webinar. We hope to have it next week. We're trying to get the materials reviewed and prepared, so stay tuned for an announcement from us. We'll be setting up webinars from there, again, on public participation in our rulemaking process and the risk assessment piece, and then we'll be posting data as we have it QA'd and available. So you'll be hearing from us in the next, over the next few weeks regularly. But again, if you have questions or concerns, please feel free to contact me, McKelvey, McKelvey.Laura, Laura, at EPA.gov, and my number is 919-541-5497, or you can contact Holly Wilson as well. And Holly, you can tell them your number.
Okay. My email address is Wilson, WILSON, .Holly, HOLLY, at EPA.gov. And my phone number is 919-541-5624.
All right, thanks, folks. One last question I have, if you will call us and let us have feedback. We wanted to know if it would be better to have some of these webinars in the evening time as opposed to during the day. So we'd like to have your feedback on that. If you send Holly or I an email, we'd appreciate that input. With that, we're going to sign off, and I thank you for calling in.